Hey internets, when it comes to the type of people who will try to argue that culture does not matter, you may have found that they mostly fall into two different camps. The first of these camps is the projector camp, the people who will accuse others of being distracted by the culture war, despite the fact that they themselves are very much ingrained in the culture war. These people usually tend to be the progressive woke types, but I've seen this behavior from non-wokes as well. And I've already made a video on this camp and why they are wrong. TLDR, they just kinda lack self-awareness. However, there is another camp of people who will also try to argue that culture doesn't matter. And this is a camp of people who are not really projecting. These are people who genuinely believe that culture does not matter. Or at the very least, they'll try to downplay the importance of culture by calling anything that talks about it quote-unquote culture war schlop, and just using that label as an argument against the topic altogether. And they genuinely make an active and determined effort to distance themselves from anything you can call a quote-unquote culture war. And because I see this camp a lot more within some of the more academic, higher IQ libertarian circles, I'm going to focus this video on this group and why I believe they are making a very grave mistake. And what I see instead is a lot of libertarians thinking that they can just exist somewhere on the internet in some Rothbardian Discord, discussing natural law theory with each other and having a good old time. Honestly, nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's pretty based. But the issue comes in when a lot of them start thinking that the solution to society is for everyone to just wake up one day and come to their senses and for the whole world to just come and join them. And spoiler alert, unfortunately, this is just not going to happen. It would be nice if it would happen. It would be absolutely wonderful if people would just suddenly magically start being smarter, but it's just not how human psychology works. And it's also libertarians giving up a very good strategy that I will go into more as this video goes on. And so I will explain why this mistake is costing the libertarian movement to have any chance of any real victory within our lifetimes. But first off, I'd like to thank this video's sponsor. The reality is, if you are not using a VPN these days, you are susceptible to having your data stolen by copyright trolls, government agencies, identity thieves, scammers, and hackers, all of whom are in the business of ripping you off or extorting you in one way or another. That's where this video's sponsor, Private Internet Access, comes into play. They keep your data safe by masking your connection through no-log RAM-only servers, and it should be emphasized that their no-logs policy has been proven several times in court and in various independent audits, thus keeping your data out of the hands of bad actors, whoever they may be. And in addition to data security and encryption, it also has some nice additional features like auto-blocking of known malicious domains used by ad trackers and malware. So it's also helpful towards keeping your system clean of viruses and other trashware you don't want. It's also by far the most stable VPN I've used, which is why it's been my go-to for years, and it's available on all devices, including Linux. But in addition to security, Private Internet Access also has servers all over the globe, meaning it can also be used to unlock geo-restricted features. Many websites limit your choices and shopping deals based on where you are located, and many streaming services like Prime Video, Netflix, Hulu, etc., they all restrict the movies and TV shows you can watch based on your location as well. And with this, you can switch your IP to whatever region you want, thus massively expanding your streaming library, all at a very low cost. Because Private Internet Access is also very affordable. If you use my link in the description or scan this QR code, you can get it now for 83% off at only $2.03 per month, and with 4 months free, and all covered with a 30-day money-back guarantee. So there's really no reason not to give it a try. It's a good VPN. Anyways, let's start things off with why the quote-unquote culture war actually matters, with the main reason being that culture is intrinsically connected to everything else in society, and there's really no way to disconnect it. When you look into culture and how it influences society, you'll find out that there's a lot of disagreement. But a lot of people argue that it flows in specific directions. For instance, people will say that politics is downstream from culture, but that's not the complete picture. As I went over in my old video on culture wars, culture is also influenced by intelligentsia or the cathedral and media and academia, etc., etc. And the thing is, politics can also give power and funding to that system as well. And the thing is, anybody as an individual can choose to act on any one of these structures of power in order to try and influence things into their desired direction. So for example, you actually can reverse the normal direction that this kind of influence flows by joining politics, and then using that political position of yours to defund certain research groups, or defund or delegitimize a media organization somehow that's pushing a cultural idea, and through that you will have influenced culture through politics. And because culture can influence politics, culture is therefore a power structure that is just as legitimate as any other political or intellectual institution. And we kind of saw a recent example of this with Elon Musk and Doge. Doge defunded a lot of media contracts the state had with the media because those contracts had a specific ideological bend to them, which caused the media to move a little bit more to the center, which is why you may have noticed in the last 2 years or so that culture itself has kind of been moving moving more to the center. That doesn't mean that woke ideology is dead. The wokeists absolutely still believe what they believe and are basically just biding their time to make a comeback, as evidenced by things like the mixtape fiasco, which basically reveals that the Neo Marxists are still very much in charge of most of the media. But again, things have at least kind of shifted away from them just a little bit. The point is, it all connects, and one of the reasons it connects really just comes down to human psychology, which is kind of the biggest flaw I see with the types of libertarians who believe that the culture war shouldn't matter to libertarians at all. It is often people who are philosophy-minded themselves, and they're making the mistake of psychologically projecting that mindset onto others. But the thing is, most people in this world do not think like that. And so here's some statistics and some studies that will give you some better insight into the psychology of your average person, to give you all a better understanding of what I'm alluding to here. Let's start with religion. Globally, close to 90% of the population will end up just staying in whatever religion they are raised in for pretty much their entire life. It varies slightly from religion to religion, and it can also vary slightly based on the economic status of the country that the person is living in. But at the very least, even in the highest conditions, where people have access to free information, this statistic still remains above 50% for most religions. And some people might wonder, okay, why does that matter? Well, what it is, it's kind of the single most obvious proof that the average person really just adopts the ideology and the morality and the belief system of their peer group that they're raised in. They don't really question it, they just kind of go along with the ride. And the thing is, this mentality of the average person extends into more than just religion. There have been many studies on things like this, the development of moral values in cultural contexts. The TLDR of it is that a very sizable chunk of the population largely gets their morality and their sense of ethics in the cultural context of just kind of interacting with others and emulating others' points of views, and then ultimately just adopting the morality of their peer group. It's something that starts at an early age. It doesn't really come from a place of aggressively studying philosophy or anything. For most people, it's actually a very simple thing, and it starts very early in psychological development. This one can be hard to exactly measure because it's kind of a qualitative thing, and of course there's the thing of revealed preference versus stated preference. But when asked about it in the United States, only 7% of people say the media is not a factor in shaping moral values. Of course, depending on people's belief systems, they disagree on whether that's a good or a bad thing. But most people, at the very least, admit that we do get these things from the media. In other words, culture has a very strong impact on how the average person views philosophy, because these are the same things that people discover through philosophy. What is correct? What is moral? What is true? And the reality is, most people are not really interested in studying these things at any kind of academic level. In other words, yes, the layman unironically kind of got their morality from watching Bambi. You can say that that's stupid, but it is how people think, which is then further proven by a lot of other things. For instance, the fact that there is a sizable chunk of the population that just wants to believe what the group believes. Combine that with things like cultivation theory in the media, which shows that people are more likely to believe that the rest of the world aligns with the messages and the morality that is being portrayed on images and TV shows, etc., etc. And it becomes very obvious just how much this can influence the mind of the normie. And here's the big kicker on top of it all. The interest a person has in going deeper into philosophy and studying things like ethics and natural law theory, for example, for libertarians, greatly differs by average IQ. And the thing is, we know by this point that at an individual level, this is largely genetic. In other words, Tyrone and Cletus are never going to become well-read philosophers. It's just not going to happen. They are going to get their philosophy from a combination of Saturday morning cartoons, Skibbity Toilet, and whatever their fourth grade teacher had to say. And then when they grow up, this isn't really going to change. It's just going to become Netflix shows, and whatever ideology is portrayed as popular within the area that they live in. That's just how it is with a lot of people. And you can complain about it, but the thing is, you really can't fault people for it, because again, a lot of it is genetic. There was actually a very recent study that a lot of people were talking about on X about this. That was a genetic association study of human personality types, which showed that the big 5 personality traits, so openness to experience, neuroticism, conscientiousness, agreeableness, extroversion, those things have, to some degree, a genetic component. People are not the same. People are not equal. And really, it's just kind of obvious if you just look at a few basic things. For instance, one question you could ask yourself that could prove this even without some of the more recent studies on genetics is, why isn't everybody Leonardo da Vinci? The average poor person in a first world country today, not just a middle class or upper middle class or rich person, the average poor individual in a first world country has greater economic access to resources and greater intellectual access to things things like the library for basically free than Leonardo da Vinci did back when he was alive. And so why aren't all of these people becoming brilliant inventors? And the answer is because people are just innately different. And this just highlights the importance of studying psychology and studying its impact on how people think. If you only study philosophy and you only study economics, but you skip out on how people actually think, then you might actually fall for this high IQ projection scheme. And I know because I used to be one of the libertarians that fell for it. I myself used to be one of the people who's like, oh, culture doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is truth. And that was projection. It's me assuming that, oh, this is what matters to me, therefore it must matter to others. And then I studied psychology and realized how wrong that was. And here's the big kicker. Marxists, Neo Marxists especially, understand this. They get it very well. A lot of times when they try to say, oh, you're being distracted by the culture war, or that the culture war was designed by the capitalists to prevent the proletariat from achieving class consciousness, they're actually just tricking you into ignoring their subversive tactics. And so they know that worming their way into the media and injecting their ideology into, say, Saturday morning cartoons, while it may sound like a silly strategy, but the thing is it's actually not, because it is genuinely one of the ways that people come to believe things. That is part of the reason why neo-Marxists control so many of our intellectual institutions these days. It is precisely because they walked into these institutions and started subverting them from within, because they understand that subverting the media is an effective way to spread their ideology. And one of the ways that they get away with this subversion is by tricking people who are against their ideology into thinking that nothing is really going on. Hence why they viciously deny it when it's called out, even if the evidence against them is obvious. Or to summarize, as this post from X puts it, culture reflects attitudes and people as a whole. If you aren't talking about culture, you aren't looking at people. And the neo-Marxists and the far left and the communists, they understand this. And they use culture to talk to the people, and then they try to trick you into thinking it doesn't matter, so that way you're not looking at people. You're just looking inward at your echo chamber and are therefore a non-threat to their schemes. Getting the Rothbardian free marketeers to just sit in an echo chamber in some Discord somewhere is precisely what neo-Marxists want you to do. They want you to think that things like Gamergate don't matter. They want you to think that you are above the culture war, as it's called. Because by doing that, by tricking you into believing it doesn't matter, they thus remove you from the competition within these institutions, allowing them to retain complete control. And thus this allows them to get away with their tactic of using the mob to try and brute force random organizations to bending the knee to their cause. This is a big reason why my own channel, I tend to have my content go back and forth between libertarian theory, refuting random things, and culture issues. Or as I responded to some VTubers, Kirsche and Leaflet, about the woke mob trying to get companies to cater to their ideology, said, this is why I try to explain to other lolberts that culture matters. We need to hold these organizations financially accountable for hating us, or else we will never counteract the leftists who are constantly encouraging them to hate us. The neo-Marxists know that as long as they have the loudest voice on cultural issues, then that is what other organizations will adopt and reflect in their own policies. Because it's all interconnected. Another argument I see comes from these types themselves, the libertarians, who again believe they're above the culture war. And it's a bit of a kerfuffle, a bit of a mistaken argument. And it can be summarized by this post here. Why did the Trump camp share the Obama monkey video this week? Regardless if you think it was racist or hilarious, it's because when they fail on policy, they pivot to a culture war. And both sides do it because it's a uniparty, and predictable. And I can definitely see why a lot of people fall for this one, because it's mostly true. Yes, when a politician screws up and their policies don't do what they claim that they would do, or they pass policies that are the opposite of what they claimed they would pass when they were running for office, you know, kind of the old meme of, but I didn't vote for this, the voter says, lol, LMAO, said the politician. Because, of course, elected officials don't actually have to do what they're elected to do. But that's, of course, the democracy discussion, which is a different discussion altogether. The issue here is that this is actually an example of an association fallacy, mixed a little bit with the fallacy of the indistributed middle. For instance, you may have heard the error all A are B and all C are B, therefore all A are C, which is incorrect. For instance, then you'd have to concede that all apples are fruits, all oranges are fruits, therefore all apples are oranges, which isn't actually true. Yes, it is true that liars and scammers are often politicians, and yes, it's true that politicians like to engage in distractions when their policies fail. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the distractions they use are inherently lies themselves. They're just trying to get the spotlight away from them as an individual. But that does not mean that where they've moved the spotlight to is somewhere that doesn't actually matter in the grand scheme of things. And I see a lot of people fall for this one because, again, it's also to some degree an association fallacy. It's very easy to associate the idea of culture war with dishonest politicians, and then come to the conclusion that the entire discussion itself is just a big fat scam. But that's actually invalid reasoning. Culture absolutely matters, and that's why they like to turn the spotlight to culture. Because when a politician screws up, they can either distract people with a real issue or distract people with a fake issue. And as it turns out, distracting people with a real issue just so happens to have greater long-term effects and works for a lot longer because, again, it's a real issue. If politicians used fake issues as a distraction all the time, then, well, it wouldn't really be a very good distraction, would it? People would just immediately quickly realize that whatever they were talking about was nonsense, and then the spotlight would go right back to the politicians and their failures. And that's why politicians, again, use cultural issues as their favorite red herring. Red herrings are more effective when they are true. Another thing I've noticed is that the type of libertarians who believe that culture doesn't matter or that we're above the culture war, blah, 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 etc., is that they're often the same libertarians who reject Hans Hermann Hoppe. And it usually comes from a place of them misunderstanding Hoppe's work as works of pragmatism, thinking that Hoppe is just a prag whose goal is to subvert libertarianism into neo-Nazism, which is quite sad because the exact opposite is actually true. Libertarians getting involved in culture and finding that culture mattering to libertarians is actually an excellent strategy that avoids pragmatism, because it allows libertarianism to accomplish wins against the communists using physical removal, which is an entirely valid libertarian strategy that is not pragmatic at all, and is in fact necessary for a liberty-based society to last more than one generation. That is what Hoppe's work actually proves. And it is actually the left pragmatists who dislike that, because they don't like to be told that being a total degenerate wouldn't actually work in libertarian society in practice. But the reality is, libertarian philosophy is a philosophy of essentially just property rights, and either abolishing or at the very least minimizing the non-productive class, aka the people who are privileged to be allowed to ignore other people's private property rights. And the thing is, tolerance is not a part of those rights. You are not required to tolerate someone on your property. If someone is being a dick to you and they're in your house, you should have the right to tell them to leave. You should have the right to engage in physical removal. That is part of what property rights are. That is not pragmatic at all. And people who are familiar with libertarian philosophy know that this is honestly kind of basic stuff. But here's the thing that the left libertarians don't like. You scale this simple concept up to that of society and multiple societies, and it becomes clear that cultural values, because they are again intrinsically tied to basically everything, well, they become a big deciding factor in the value of that society as a whole, as it directly affects its sustainability and ability to pass on the torch and survive for longer than a decade or so. For example, social welfare in a libertarian society would not be an entitlement statist-based program like our welfare system we have in many first world countries today in the West. Rather, it would become a privatized system. It would be a system based on, again, private property rights. And thus it makes financial sense to physically remove those who seek to mooch off of that welfare system, rather than as a temporary way to help get themselves out of trouble. And thus societies, by a simple process of natural selection, would end up adopting more low time preference cultural values, which tend to lean conservatives. We've actually seen this in history. If you look at the private welfare systems of the past before the New Deal, we see how they often had behavioral requirements in order to maintain or apply for membership. And those requirements ultimately tended to frown upon degenerate behavior. And it's really not that hard to understand why. I mean, just imagine yourself as the private owner of one such system. Looking at your finances, you notice that people who are hard drug abusers tend to be, well, net negatives, almost always finding themselves in distress and in need of assistance from the mutual aid fund, and they just keep screwing up over and over again. Thus, the incentive to require prospective members to, at the very least, submit to rehab and make a concentrated effort to overcome their addiction becomes the obvious answer to your problem, or just physically removing them altogether by banning drug abusers from joining the mutual aid fund. Because social welfare already is hard enough to take care of the people who fall ill to no fault of their own. And so why should you be taking a profit loss for the people who are the cause of their own problem? So it just makes sense in an actual free society to not be degenerate. It's just more profitable in the long run. And there's also just an inherent problem of hypocrisy of any left libertarian who takes issue with this and tries to reject Hoppe's work or downplay his importance. Here we have the Classical Liberal Caucus of Texas posting a long time ago, which, by the way, don't hold them accountable for this because they're now under better leadership. But basically, they posted this typical meme of basically saying Hoppe bad, thanking all these philosophers for their contributions to libertarian theory, but not Hoppe. To which I responded this: there's a much more direct question for libertarians who reject Hoppe. How exactly would you stop a private city society with right-wing values from forming without violating the NAP? The answer answer hilariously is that you must form a libertarian private society of your own and physically remove the Hoppians, which means you have become us. You have admitted that we are right. Are you going to physically remove yourselves next? Either that, or you create a state that bans any form of private cities from existing, in which case you have ceased to be libertarian. The reality is that society needs some kind of rule of law in order to function and facilitate economic growth. Libertarianism simply replaces that law with a system that is in line with voluntary association instead of by force through a non-productive class. This means there will still be rules. Libertarianism is not when no rules. And I'd like to add to this that this also means that libertarianism is not when no culture. Libertarianism is when society and rule places the nap first, which means that if people do not want to associate with crappy culture and don't want to associate with those who litter the streets, and a private society doesn't want to have people camping on the sidewalks while shooting up heroin, well then removing them is entirely within their rights within a libertarian society, and is in fact easier to do and more effective to do than how Western society and rules currently work today. Anybody who denies this and says that, oh well, that's authoritarian to kick these people out of your society, well then you also have to claim that the NAP itself is authoritarian, in which case the left libertarian has simply become a communist with extra steps. And so this just all brings us to the question, what should the libertarian strategy be in regards to culture then? And I believe the optimal strategy is actually just a two-pronged approach. The first is that we need to start actually fighting the Marxists where they are, as opposed to just constantly infighting. If you believe in liberty and believe in the free market, and you are in a position to influence one of these institutions, then you should do so. A lot of people who get into libertarian theory, especially the people who reject Hoppe, which again is often the libertarians who think that culture wars don't matter, it comes from the misunderstanding of, again, thinking that tolerance and acceptance is a libertarian value. And no, they're not. You do not have to leave culture alone. You do not have to just accept the garbage propaganda that neo-Marxists are constantly churning out using their connections and positions within the media. If you are in a position where you can gain control of these and do something about it, then you should. It is entirely within libertarian values to do something like publishing a non-fiction book and having a story that reflects those values. It is, again, a very weird blindside that currently exists within libertarian strategy to just ignore the culture war, when it is in fact a fantastic way to talk to ordinary, normal, everyday people in a way that doesn't sound completely preachy. Because when you just come to someone, and if you were to walk up to someone on the street and just say, hey, do you want to talk about Rothbard's theories on the anatomy of the state? I mean, let's just be real for a moment. You're going to come across as a total autist. That is not how the average person comes to believe things. And it often makes very little sense to me, because it's often also the people who are the anti-pragmatic, naptists, nap worshippers, those type of libertarians who look down on these cultural issues. And yet cultural issues are a libertarian strategy towards getting more libertarians that does not violate the NAP. It is actually one of the most effective non-pragmatic strategies we have. And yet what I'll often see, for example, in my own channel, is I'll make a video calling out some journalists for some Marxist subversion, and yet one of these naptists will come in and go, oh, this is culture war schlop. Because apparently, when I was not aware of it, not calling out neo-Marxist subversions of our media institutions and just doing nothing while the neo-Marxists continue to retain complete control and brainwash the next generation with their nonsense, apparently it just became an unspoken rule in libertarian circles that we're just going to let the neo-Marxists do that and not push back against it at all. And yes, I know I'm kind of breaking one of my own rules here and engaging in some libertarian infighting with this video here, but it really needs to be called out and emphasized just how toxic this mentality is to the liberty movement as a whole. It's like they're addicted to losing or something. Or in other words, de-Marxist subversion of our cultural institutions is good, actually. It is completely within libertarian ethics and philosophy to do so. It does not violate the NAP in any way. It is basically free real estate and free libertarian strategy that the current Libertarian Party officials just kind of look at and look down on and just completely ignore. And that's ridiculous. It is untapped potential, and again, it just completely ignores how psychology works. The idea that everyone will just suddenly come to their senses and decide to be a philosopher and decide to aggressively study economics, and that everyone would do so if they just had the right environment, well, that mentality falls into the same fallacious thinking of the liberals who fell for the tabula rasa scam, believing that everybody is just a blank slate, and if we all had the perfect environment, we would all be Einstein. And the evidence is kind of in. This is just not the case. It is not true. People are different, and many psychological traits are genetic. Libertarians need to accept this and move past this. The other prong of this strategy is just attacking the current culture issues from a libertarian perspective. And one very good angle of this is showing how a lot of the cultural decay is actually due to, again, the welfare state. Here's a really good article from Mises Wire, The Cultural Consequences consequences of the welfare state. The basic idea of it is just using the state to entitle people to the things that the mutual aid societies of the past used to do instead. Early systems in the 1800s being compulsory insurance for accident, health, disability, and age, pensions, and then called this state socialism. And again, these are things that people could already buy and join from private markets. And here's the thing, this state socialism was not done to make these programs more efficient, but rather it was done to generate dependence and loyalty. It certainly wasn't because it's more profitable to do things this way. In fact, quite the opposite. This ends up costing society way more in the long run. But the bigger problem is that it gets rid of the physical removal aspect, which would ordinarily allow the free market to weed out degeneracy. And here's the thing, this has been going on for so long that people have essentially forgotten about it. One of the key issues with libertarianism I see coming from kind of general bog standard conservatives is that they think that what we're seeing in our cultural degeneracy and decline of the West is due to woke capitalism, when in fact the exact opposite is true. It's because we got rid of the financial constraints on degeneracy and replaced them with entitlement, as the welfare state completely lacks the behavioral requirements that naturally show up in mutual aid societies of the past. And so thus, crime rates, dependency, structural unemployment, parasitism, psychopathy, and hedonism have increased. And the article explains the reason. It's that for the public, government moderation has only disadvantages. When you receive a subsidy without any kind of quid pro quo, there is no incentive to be more productive in the future. As a result, productive activity and long-term forecast decline, redistribution taxes the most productive individuals by removing their incentive to produce, leading to the infantilization and moral degeneration of civil society. And to add to this, the thing that a lot of people look at today is the question of public trust and the failure of multiculturalism, with the standard complaint being that Western society keeps getting flooded with immigrants, a lot of whom are strangely non-productive. And the reason why is because the welfare state kind of incentivizes them to come here without actually needing to be productive. And so now Western civilization is finding itself in a position where the people who built the society and are funding that society, well, we find ourselves being forced to fund the welfare of our effective replacement. And because the welfare state is again an entitlement, it doesn't actually have any kind of behavioral or cultural or any kind of value requirement to it. And by value in this context, I mean social values, the need to be a civilized human being. Because these entitlement systems lack that, well, the situation we find ourselves in was inevitable. Or as the article points out, the welfare state has led to the elimination of the responsibility to act decently, encouraging incivility, vandalism, and lawbreaking. And honestly, when you take a step back and look at it from an outside-in perspective, it's kind of obvious. When you eliminate the need to be a decent person in order to have access to the social safety net of a society, then well, surprise, surprise, people are going to come in and have no incentive to be decent people. And what libertarians need to do is we need to point out that these issues with cultural degeneracy, they're just going to keep happening so long as we have this entitlement system. Because a lot of conservatives, they'll just go down the rabbit hole of becoming a white nationalist or something in response to this. But then they'll want to keep the welfare state. They don't want to do anything about getting rid of the welfare. And they don't realize that if you have a welfare state with, say, white people only, so ethno-nationalist socialism, I mean, sure, that might be a little better than multicultural socialism, but it's still socialism and it's still entitlement, and so people will still lack the incentive to actually be decent human beings. And so you're really not fixing much unless you get rid of the entitlement. With the irony being that the welfare state actually hurts the poor because the welfare state makes society suck. And so when libertarians take a step away from this and just completely ignore the culture war, we're kind of giving Marxists a platform to sell their own solution. Their solution to cultural degeneracy, their answer to why the streets have so much trash, why there's a lack of social trust, why is housing so expensive, why do we have all these homeless people? Well, the Neo Marxists, they like to get their little claws on the media and sell the idea that this is all because of capitalism, which is a complete lie. It was all caused by state socialism. And yet the Neo Marxists are constantly creating stories within video games and within movies and TV shows and books, etc., and have fully ingrained themselves into intellectual institutions. And then they use the cultural decay that's largely caused by them as evidence of late-stage capitalism, selling the idea that it's the lack of equity and lack of free stuff and lack of entitlement that's causing all of these issues. And when libertarians, when we walk away from this, when we say that, oh, the culture wars are beneath us, well, we're just handing the neo-Marxists a free victory. We're not talking to the average person, to the average guy on the street, in a way that he will actually care to listen. We're just gonna let them say that the solution to all of our problems is more government intervention, more free stuff, more entitlements, more tolerance and acceptance of multiculturalism, more moral relativism, and other such nonsense. And in response to this, I will just point out to a simple fact, and I don't mean to brag here, but there's a reason why my channel broke the normal 100k subscriber libertarian curse. And it's really not a big secret. I just make content about some of the issues that everyday normal people are talking about and explain why the Neo Marxist solutions that are being offered are entirely fraudulent solutions. Because if you want to really spread the message of liberty and explain why the free market is a good thing, you gotta talk about issues that the average person actually cares about. It really is that simple. Anyways, that's all I have to say. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And if you like my content, you can support me on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or by buying some merch, or again by checking out this video's sponsor, Private Internet Access. Thanks again for watching. That is all. Till next time.